Resume recording. So as the first item, I apologize, I was not able to finish the meeting minutes from our October 24th meeting. I will be playing catch up this week.
Okay.
All right, and should I roll into the
You should.
presentation? Okay. So our last discussion with EDAB was earlier this week. I don't have a ton of additional project updates, a few other things not directly related to the zoning, which we've been talking a lot about with the subcommittee. But I did just want to give the preview of the November 17th Chestnut Hill Commercial Area Community Advisory Group agenda to help inform your discussion, give some context for that. So we're planning on, staff will give a project update to kick things off. It will be relatively short, sort of table setting. And I think, we want to be able to address some of the issues, concerns that were raised during the community advisory group member discussion, as well as public comment at the previous meeting. And then we've carved out about half an hour for Q&A discussion with the subcommittee and community advisory group members. We did ask community advisory group members to submit any specific questions they're hoping that the subcommittee will be able to address by Monday. So I'll get those over to you as soon as I can, just to have a good sense of what people are interested in getting out of this joint meeting discussion. And then your segment will be followed by a presentation from staff and Sasaki with the status update about where we're at in terms of the design guidelines. So our goal is that we're going to have draft design guidelines for the 3 sub-districts south of Boylston Street to present for feedback. And then our transportation consultant will come in with an update about where they're at in terms of multimodal capacity and safety improvements, which we started a conversation at the last meeting. And we'll be presenting a more detailed menu and set of options for feedback. So I'm just going to go around the circle here with the study components, and I did just want to do a quick sanity check and make sure that Sandy's not. Oh, hold on. I'm going to stop sharing to let people in from the waiting room. Okay. So Michael and Sandy just joined us. Hi, Michael and Sandy. Sorry for keeping you in the waiting room. Okay, so
No worries.
back to sharing. Mhm. All right, Zoom is being contrary. I'm not sharing my screen right now, am I?
You are.
Oh, okay. I can't see what I'm sharing. Okay. So, in terms of, since the EDAB meeting on Monday, we've received the draft technical memo from our consultants regarding the conceptual improvements for the bike pedestrian network and the intersection upgrades. So we provided some feedback. We'll be meeting with them again early next week and finalizing recommendations, what's going to be presented to the community advisory group for Monday's meeting. Design guidelines, we've had several meetings with Sasaki at this point. We did have a meeting with Feingold Alexander, Sasaki, and staff to kind of better understand issues, considerations, particularly regarding the Heath Street proposed step backs. So we're working through that, but the goal is to present a resolution at the next meeting for feedback. And then the rezoning, we've incorporated a lot of the edits, feedback that we've accumulated over the past several weeks into the draft zoning. I'm waiting until we're in a better place in terms of the design guidelines before circulating that updated draft. So hopefully with the community advisory group packet materials that will go from a week from today, there'll be an updated draft of the zoning language. And then the town protections, so we're working on drafting the report and providing a little bit more detail about the commercial area vibrancy enhancements. And then we are starting to think more concretely about what are appropriate items to have in the MOA. And that is, the update in terms of other study elements that we're working on.
Meredith, has town council come up with a mechanism that they feel is doable in terms of tax certainty?
So tax certainty, I think we're just using the same format that we've used for previous negotiations like this, where just to make sure I'm answering your question. So for the town meeting, there'll be the warrant article with the zoning amendments. There'll be 2 other warrant articles authorizing the select board to enter into an MOA. And then there'll be a copy of the MOA, which will include the tax certainty piece. And then there'll be a separate warrant article authorizing the select board to enter into a tax certainty agreement.
But is that tax certainty agreement secured by a title encumbrance?
Oh, so we would do the easement exchange.
The easement, okay, that's
the vehicle.
Okay, thank you.
That was done at the Davis Path and others.
And Brookline Place, yes, it was.
Brookline Place, yeah.
But there was town-owned land in those cases, I believe. In this case, there isn't.
No, there is. There's an easement. There's a town water and sewer easement running through the property now.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer.
Sure.
That's great.
So the next item was preparing for the Q&A with.
Could I just jump in, Meredith, just make a simple comment that I don't think there's anything that's being proposed so far that hasn't actually been done in other overlay districts. In terms of things we've used in the past with regard to trying to set like a sky plane or setbacks or things like that at vertical levels and setbacks of buildings from specific streets and things like that have been done in other zoning overlays. I don't think since we dropped the PDA concept, I think we're basically using policies that have been used elsewhere in our upzoning exercises or zoning bylaw amendments.
I think the only new tool is the minimum commercial requirement.
Oh, correct. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's always been at grade level.
And also, what about the bonuses? Are those new?
The specific bonuses are new, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
But the underlying zoning now
that,
has commercial requirements in certain districts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, why don't you go on, Meredith?
Oh, I'm sorry, George. That was sort of the scope of my project update. I'd say from the Monday EDAB meeting, I don't think we have any additional items to report on.
So the next item is preparing for the meeting with the community group.
Yes. So
Ken, you had specific ideas on that one. Do you want to talk about those?
Sure. I've attended, I believe, all the CAG meetings, and my assessment, and Janice can jump in, and Michael and others, that the neighbors their primary concern is about the scale of the project, particularly as it relates to maximum building height and the context or lack thereof of neighboring properties. There is also some concern in the site plan dimensions about moving the massing away from the southwest corner, where the primary representation of neighbors is those most immediately affected that are along Heath Street, Glenland, the Hammond Pond Parkway. I think that's fair to say. To that end, I think it would be helpful for the subcommittee to address in, I guess, a primer type of format, the challenges of doing a site, what I would call like a site plan jigsaw, where you have to make all the components of a site plan work, both from a regulatory standpoint and a market standpoint. And so when there are things that are changed so overlaying all the areas, for example, that you can't build in, building setbacks, and then requirements for circulation, requirements for parking, requirements for all these things, how that impacts where and how big the footprints could be. So that would be one element of area of discussion in terms of just further educating the neighbors as to the development feasibility. The second component would be on building height, and in particular, how the three levels within the mass building code generates cost and economies of scale implications for both materials use and MEP systems, things like stairwell pressurization and that type of thing. And then a third element would be on making sure that the proposed footprints are feasible based on things like distance from the core of the building to the window line, being able to accommodate double loaded corridors for multifamily and hotel, and things like emergency depth to emergency access stairwells and things like that. So that people can understand it's not just a matter of pushing down the height of a building and then expanding the footprint. It's not that easy. So I think those are the three things that I would recommend. And they've kind of heard from me. So I think it would be good if George and Sandy and Mark could jump in and specifically, if you might provide some examples of projects you worked on or other projects in town that sort of illustrate key points.
So I guess I'd put it to members of the committee who are attending this meeting. Does what Ken described to you sound right to you in terms of how we could be of most value to your thinking about this project?
If I can say, I think they've heard all of this really from us, and I think perhaps repeating it and repeating it from the perspective of people who've actually been involved in development might be helpful. And I emphasize might is in italics. There's a fundamental objection to the idea of 12 stories, just as there was a fundamental objection to higher structures. And the question is, well, at what point do you say the trade-offs between 12 stories and 10 stories aren't here? Here are the trade-offs that you would face. And I think that would be useful. So the direction that Ken was going in does make some sense to me. But again, it's a matter of saying, well, you want this instead of that. Here's what you give up, so that it's very clear to people what they lose.
Okay. Janice, does that sound right to you?
So I wanted to respond. First, I think Ken really presented it well as to the concerns. I will say that what bothers me the most as a person who lives in the area is the complete lack of context of this project. It still feels to me very disconnected from the way we live out here. And I don't know how to reconcile that, honestly. But, there are elements in our neighborhood that are not going to change. I mean, Hammond Pond, that's staying. The street that was just redeveloped, that's staying. The cemetery, that's staying. So I want to really know better how this project fits into an area that has a lot of elements that are not going to change. And I've had conversations, I know, with Michael, well, actually with both Michaels, Mike and Michael, about the fact that I really am concerned that what we're building on the Brookline side is going to look like a wall, an impenetrable wall. And the other side is very light and airy. And I know that some of it is simply geography, right? You know, the open space that we have on the Brookline side is going to be literally buried behind whatever we build on the Brookline side. And it feels to me that it 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 just doesn't, I don't feel connected, and I want to feel connected. I would like to spend my dollars in Brookline, not Newton. Um, and so that's still a real concern of mine, that that initially, and I understand, and I want to, you know, do a shout out actually to Cliff, that he did listen to the early discussions, but then what came out of that was an attempt to make this 5 acres do everything. And I think that that's, you know, that's, it ended up being really a very dense and difficult project for the neighborhood to wrap their heads around. And so I still feel that we're, you know, that we're not there. You know, we're definitely better with the lower project, the lower building against the neighborhood. I think that definitely was something the neighborhood asked for, and I appreciate that. And the fact that it's residential connects a little bit to the residential, the residences, you know, because we live here. But it still to me feels out of context. And I don't, you know, I don't know how to solve that part of the jigsaw. I really appreciated that description. It is really a jigsaw, and finding a way to make all the elements work for the project and for the neighborhood is complex. Yeah.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, so following up on both Ken and Janice and Mike's comments as well. I had a meeting last night with 7 of the neighbors at Blair Hines' house, including him and his wife and 5 other neighbors, all of who have been involved in the project thus far. And we spent a lot of time talking about, you know, their concerns about height, and a better understanding of the trade-offs. And one of the things that I learned in that evening is that, you know, when people who talked about, you know, protecting from creating the separation along the western edge with larger setbacks, or the setbacks from Heath Street, or the shifting of the massing from southwest to northeast, as it is now, and the amount of open space and the amount of usable space and parking, et cetera, the jigsaw puzzle pieces that Ken talked about, I think that and they expressed that they didn't really realize the impact of those requirements on the amount of density that could be built, and to the extent that we wanted a certain amount of density, the effect that that would have on height, and how all of those pieces were tied together. So I think, at least for the 7 people that were there, they had a better understanding of that after that meeting. But the 2 questions that they raised really were, the first question, and this was born out of a sort of a frustration and a perception that the town was giving something of great value to the developer and not necessarily getting something back, something in return. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that, but that was what they expressed. And understanding, you know, what was paid for the land and what the impact that has on the overall project. And the other question that they had was a better understanding, that I think Ken started to talk about, of of how all those jigsaw pieces fit together from the developer's perspective, because of course they and we generally don't have access to the pro formas, so we don't necessarily understand all the financing decisions that are being made from the developer perspective. But to be able to understand that broadly would be really helpful from a base level where that's pretty basic, you know. I think they understand budgets and they understand, maybe revenues and expenses, but all of the factors of financing and the trade-offs that Ken mentioned, et cetera, I think they felt like they needed more information. And so I would hope that on the 17th, there's some sort of presentation that this committee and the developers' expertise can demonstrate to answer that question. I don't know if that will relieve the frustration, but I think that them feeling like they don't understand why is an important factor. I will add one third thing, is that unlike a lot of other developments where we have been trying to shrink the development down to the smallest possible economically viable project, there's another interest in this case, which is the town's interest, in both in terms of economic development and in terms of net fiscal impact, tax revenue, less costs. And that factor is also has an impact on what the overall zoning is. It's not just what's the minimum viable project that a developer can produce, but also how do we create the tax revenue that we need within the town, as we have done in other areas of the town, whether it's Brookline Place or Waldo Durgan or other large developments that we've done over time, in order to deal with the fiscal challenges that the town is facing. So all three of those perspectives we discussed and have to be incorporated, but there were those two particular questions, one related to the land and one related to the economic viability from the developer perspective, that I think would be really helpful to be able to respond to.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to opine as to what would be most helpful in this group meeting with the community group?
George, maybe one approach to take is to just ask the members of the committee and whoever else is attending what would be helpful for them to hear. And you're a group of Brookline residents, the committee's a group of Brookline residents. I mean, we're all part of the same community, and I'd love to see this not as a group of experts coming in, because you are experts talking to a bunch of lay people. Most of the people on the committee are lay people, but sort of what can we do to help you with your understanding of this project? Just a thought.
Well, I am seeing us as reactive rather than proactive and responding to questions. That's why I'm trying to elicit, what this kind of input, because we are experts and we all have done developments not dissimilar from this. And we are indeed, Carla, as you say, residents who are really vitally concerned with the financial health of our town. And we're also looking at a site that is almost uniquely positioned to provide net tax revenues on a large scale. So, we're feeling all these impulses. Again, I don't think anyone wants to do a development or approve a development that would be detrimental to the community. I mean, we all live here. We all love Brookline. We all want to do right by the town. And we're trying to find that balance between what's doable and what minimizes negative impacts, right?
Yeah, I just don't
I'm
want.
struggling with this one, honestly, as
So
you can
am I.
hear.
And because I don't want you all to be seen as being on the side of the developer, because that's just going to maintain or retain this split.
No,
So,
absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. And again, I think our goal would be to minimize the development impact while maximizing benefits to the town. And the benefits aren't just financial. They're environmental, and they're sort of let's see, enhancing neighboring properties, and creating great adjacencies and community activity and retail activity. So, it's definitely a balancing act. And we're not just shields for the developer. That I can assure you.
yeah, right. And I know that, but you,
I
you
know.
didn't convince
know.
me.
I know.
To convince some other people.
I know.
Is it helpful, George, and I apologize because I wasn't party to the conversation on Monday due to travel, but I'm wondering if it's helpful to kind of start with the neighbors from the place that you and I chatted about last week around the zoning, right? And here's kind of the point, Carla and Janice in particular, that the zoning today that exists there hasn't yielded any fruit, if you will, in terms of development. And the site is blighted, right? It's not a great neighbor, with all due respect, Cliff, today, right? Because it's not a place anybody wants to go. It's a leftover piece of property that hasn't had a care and attention paid to it. And so the reality is, at a baseline, the only way that something happens there is with new zoning. So if we start with, and I don't know if everybody's there because I haven't been in all of the conversations that all of you have been with the neighbors. But to start from a place of, we need new zoning in order to get this property to be not just economically beneficial, but qualitatively beneficial for everyone. Like, it would be, my daughter now walks from school over to the street and she wants to go through that area. You can't, right? And so if it becomes a place where people can traverse and it becomes part of the neighborhood, that's a benefit, right? And it's not today. Today it's just this kind of other place. And so I kind of wonder, are there some baby steps we can take to get people to buy into some baselines that then get to the next step, right? Because then you're starting with, okay, we know it needs to be rezoned, so it's going to be bigger, right? It's going to have more density than what's there today. Because what's there today has, to my point, this was the point I made to George last week, today's zoning didn't yield any change in that property in what arguably was the best economic cycle many of us have seen in our careers, right? And so if it didn't yield it then, it certainly isn't going to yield it in the future. And so, I live not far, Janice knows this, but I am not a direct abutter, right? And one of the challenges, but I also live really close to the dump/transfer station and bear the brunt of the smell of that on a, beautiful summer day when I want to walk. And so part of being in a town and being in a community is we all bear different burdens, if you will, on behalf of the greater good, right? People who live on a street with a school bear extra traffic. And this might be something that this is the neighborhood's burden, right? Is now it sits next to this commercial area. None of us can sit here and tell somebody they should feel really comfortable about a 14-story building, because nothing is going to make them say, like, yes, I want that. But the flip side is, it's easy for me to say it's not bad. It's not next to me, right? And I completely appreciate that. But I also realize that I think this developer has done a really nice job of listening and modifying, and deserves credit for that, right? And not digging in to that degree. But I kind of feel, on behalf of, my role as EDAB and my role as a Brookline resident, we really need to change the zoning here, And we need to get it to be something that regardless of who the developer is, again, with all due respect, Cliff, regardless of who the developer is, that something can happen here, because it's staying like this for another 10 or 20 years is a disservice to all of us, including the people that live next door. So that's a few other thoughts. I'm curious what others think.
Janice?
Yeah, Sandy raised a few points that I'd like to sort of tease out a little bit more. Yes, no one wants to hear from people living in other parts of town. You'll get used to it, which is what we heard at the last meeting. You know, sort of get over it, you'll get used to it. That's really not a very helpful statement to make. And I will say, you know, part of the problem that we're having is that there was a process that was begun before you bought this property, Cliff, or whoever has actually owns the property. Before City Realty got a hold of the property, we had a different process that was supposed to really look at the entire site and see how the entire commercial area can grow together. To Sandy's point, yes, I agree. The commercial area needs to grow, but it should have grown more holistically. This kind of threw a monkey wrench into the whole process that those of us who signed up for the to be on this community advisory group thought that we were part of. And then suddenly we're just looking at 5 acres and how to maximize profits there. If we were really looking at the whole site, and I understand there are different developers involved, right? You'd have to all kind of work together. I think we would end up with a much better outcome to what I thought I was participating in. So that's part of why there's a kind of problem here, I think, for the neighborhood. I ran focus groups. I probably ran more focus groups than anyone else on the community advisory group because I bought into that process. I really wanted to get a holistic, really positive outcome for the town and for the neighborhood, for both. I wanted a win-win. And this coming at us the way it did, I think has been part of the problem that the developer's having now. Because that's what we see. Now we see that, well, you know, everything else, well, who cares about that? This is 5 acres and we've got a developer and he wants to develop it. But to do it so askew, you know, so skewed or askew is gonna, I think, really have negative impacts on the commercial area. And so that's what I struggle with, is that I'm totally bought into wanting a vibrant commercial area. I mean, that's what I wanted. I wanted the whole area to be activated, not just the site. I wanted it all to be. And so, you know, I don't know how to reconcile this broader vision, which I think is, you know, you talk about the town's interest. That is in the town's interest to activate the entire commercial area, not just focus all on a 5-acre site. So, and also, I'm not seeing, even this area, I'm not seeing from the plans any street level activation.
Janice?
Yeah.
Maybe sum up your comments and let.
Yeah, that's my comment, is that, so I don't see the commercial area, the street side activation that I had envisioned for the whole commercial area. That's it.
So let me just briefly respond to that. I understand your disappointment. You know, this is a bit of an opportunistic deliberation. It's because someone bought a very large site and expressed an interest in redeveloping. And what we're doing is sort of rezoning and replanning based on that immediate interest in redeveloping. But that's a real opportunity for the town because realistically, the growth companies holdings and other holdings, which are very fragmented along Boylston, are unlikely to be redeveloped in my lifetime, maybe your lifetime, you're younger, but so you can go, it isn't ideal. This process is not ideal. We are responding to a specific developer making a specific proposition. And I wish we could have an ideal commercial planning process resulting in redevelopment of the whole area. it's not going to happen that way, unfortunately, just because who owns the lands and the way the land is divided up. So I think what we're struggling with is how can we do as good a job as we possibly can with the cards we've been dealt. Michael?
Thank you, George, and thank you, Janice. One thing that I do want to say in response to Sandy's comments is that at least in all the conversations that I've had, there's pretty universal understanding that redevelopment is necessary, and an acceptance that some level of change in the zoning is appropriate. So in terms of like that first baby step, I think we have gotten there. In the course of the many months that this process has been going on, my understanding is, and some of this predates my involvement starting in May, but that there have been times when it's been more focused on the zoning, which was considered more abstract, and then there was other times where we were more focused on this particular development, and so that was more specific. But then you lose the important elements that Janice was talking about, where you really want to consider development across the whole space. But one of the sort of ways that we sort of mixed that, met that challenge, or at least we worked on last night, was coming to the realization that if you want a certain level of economic development, we had talked to, I know EDAB had talked about it in April in terms of density, and over time we've talked about it in terms of levels of commercial development. But if you want that level of activity, and that is sort of the goal both for the issues of economic vitality that you talked about, George, as well as the town's interest in finances, that the combination of constraints that met those goals were actually to some degree independent of the city realty site itself. So I'm not sure if whether or not the city realty was present or absent, except for the fact that they've actually been able to provide us with concrete examples of what the impact of the town zoning choices would actually be, and sort of given us alternatives. I'm not sure that in the aggregate, the combination of the height and the open space and the usable space, the parking space, et cetera, would actually be significantly different from where the zoning itself has landed, has ended up, because of the town's goals in terms of economic development. And I'm not sure that separation has been clearly articulated, but I think it's worth keeping in mind, so that we're not just being responsive to a proposal from City Realty, but we are taking advantage of the fact that as they bring us examples that either meet or don't meet the zoning framework that we are building, that we understand the value and the feasibility of that framework.
Thank you. My other subcommittee members, Ken, Mark, Sandy, do you have anything you'd like to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about the original question, right? How does a week from Monday, how is that facilitated? How is the communication done, right? And I think, and Ken started to go there, I think one is just, right now it is sort of abstract. What are images, precedents, benchmarks, right? Just for visuals, I think is always so helpful. I think the other thing, so that's kind of just how to maybe help couch Monday. The other thing that I think
when you say that, Mark, are you thinking do you have specific examples in mind, like the rezoning of Boylston Street down in the Fenway adjacent to low-rise stuff, or
Yeah, I mean, I think Fenway's a great example, right? I think some of Assembly Square, right? I mean, it's sort of across the street from, a bunch of triple deckers, right? In sort of similar size scale. I mean, it's right, or places in DC, right? I think it could be in Brookline and national, right? I mean, that's some homework, and just to be able to bring those images. But there,
Mhm.
I think, I guess, I'm always reluctant to say X height is wrong and Y massing is bad. It's all handled in the detail. You can have fantastic and fabulous, vibrant mixed use communities if it's all in the detail, right? And it's how is the public space handled? What are the details of finishes? What is the the circulation, right? And what's the landscaping, and what's the how do you invite it? So I think Janice was saying that how we don't feel connected, right? Like, and that's a conversation to be had, right? Like, specifically, what are the view corridors? What are the pathways? What do they look like and feel like? How do you access the space, right? To make it really tangible. So it's not just an abstract mid-rise development. It's like, just how do I, as a neighbor, access and experience entering this campus, right? And just using it. Right. So I just think just making it as tangible as possible, because you're right. I mean, right now it's just sort of an abstract renderings, right? And it's tough. So I just think, again, my big message is making Monday as tangible as possible, right? What does the connectivity look and feel like, and what are some other benchmarks?
So Mark, I am hoping that the Sasaki presentation and update on the design guidelines will help fill in some of those gaps, answer those questions. Yeah, for whatever it's worth, I don't know if the burden of that responsibility necessarily needs to fall on this subcommittee. Although I did like the idea of referencing other projects that you think have comparable contexts as a reference point.
You can relate to it, right? So it's just so hard, because it is. I mean, change and new development is always like, you just don't know what it is and what it means, right? Until you feel it and see it. So
Mhm.
Sandy, did you have any further ideas here?
I would just echo Mark, right? Like, the idea of walking around those places. I was thinking Kendall Square years ago, before it grew up. There were lots of that part of East Cambridge was or that part of Cambridge didn't have a lot of development for a really long time. And I mean, it's always surprising when it changes, right? And then, Janice, it is true, people do get used to it and it becomes part of the neighborhood. And nobody wants to believe that, but I will say, having lived next to development when I lived in the South End, a really large building went up next to us. The worst part of it was the construction. That was actually the worst part. Once it was built, everybody was actually pretty fine with it, and we all went to the shops that were built there, and we're happy to do it, and made friends with the people that live there and whatnot. Just like what's happening. I live close to Hancock Village, and a lot of people complained about it. And I ran into an old preschool teacher who moved there. So I do think there, as much as it sounds cliche and it doesn't feel good when people say that, there is actually some truth to that. And people are typically more scared of the future, right? And the unknown, because it's scary. And so walking around places and kind of realizing what it feels like, I think is important. I think it's also important to think about how close things are really, right? And just because you are the closest house to a property doesn't necessarily, like, how far away are you from it? And the shadow studies and stuff that I'm sure are available, they really do matter, right? Because people's experience of buildings is not that it's 14 stories tall. It's really what's happening in the first 20 to 30 feet, right? It's what you're walking by. And so being able to have that experience and have that experience be really good is a really big differentiator, right? Part of the reason that I would say in our neighborhood, right, of South Brookline, Chestnut Hill, the towering buildings that we have are like, they're the tower in the garden kind of buildings. They are not the buildings that are built on the streetscape to create a place that you want to walk by, right? I think about the buildings on Florence Street that are very tall, and the building over by the mall, right? They're not part of the streetscape. And I think what what is being proposed here with the zoning that City Realty has shown is very different. And it is actually more akin to the Fenway and the building, the Idol in the Fenway that is built right up next to the brownstones there. I forget which street it is, but it's the one that CCNF just built. It's not quite as tall, Janice, as the ones, and I'm looking at Janice on my screen, which is why I keep pointing to you. It's like I'm having that conversation with you. It's the way my Zoom screen landed. But it's a really good example of a building that is nestled into a neighborhood and is significantly taller than everything around it and really works, right? And doesn't feel looming. So I would try to see if we could have some examples like that. And honestly, maybe it is going on a walking tour with some of the neighbors to some of these places and talking with them about what feels good or awful about this particular spot. Because I'm going to pick on that poor building on Florence Street that's set off with the parking lot. It just looks like a big building in a parking lot. And I don't think that's what is being proposed here. And I don't think that's what we want here either, right? To be really clear, the zoning is intended to create a place that really feels walkable, and the kind of what you experience when you walk by a building is, I'm going to keep going back to that, because what's happening in the first 20 to 40 feet matter more than anything else.
So the other large area of concern is the developer getting away with murder? Is the town giving up more than it's getting? Did the developer overpay and is trying to, sort of cover his losses? I think this group can apply its expertise and answer those pretty definitively. Right now, it's very hard to make developments work, even if you have zero land value. So the fact that this developer essentially is proposing under a 4 FAR roughly $50 per developable square foot, that's the math, is pretty reasonable. I mean, that's pretty low basis for most development. So we can assure the neighbors and the community group that this developer's sort of tracking with what we see as developable numbers. And the net tax revenues, especially from the hotel component and the commercial components, are significant.
George, can I make a couple of comments?
Sure.
First of all, I think both Mark and Sandy are headed very much in the right direction. I think it's important to explain why something needs to be X number of stories instead of Y number of stories from a financial perspective. But that's not the way, I don't think that's the way to persuade people that the development is going to be ultimately beneficial to them. And I think it's very hard for somebody to envision how that benefit would play out. The idea of walking through some similar developments in the Boston area, I think that's a really good one, or at least bringing some visuals that show that, even a video as opposed to simply a photograph. The other thing is, I realize that this is it may be premature to ask the developer to say, well, what kinds of commercial enterprise, what kinds of commercial facilities do you expect to be in there? What sort of retailer do you have to be in there? There's been one discussion about, or one thing floated around about grocery store, supermarket, or something of that sort. And it depends on the kind of supermarket, and there is one right up the street and so forth at Wegmans, and down the other way at Star Market. So maybe that's not even feasible. But understanding what might be developed in there that would be a benefit to the people who live around there, as opposed to being, oh my God, this is a pain to see all this, all this huge construction. I think selling the benefits, and I use the term selling the benefits very deliberately, I think that's the best route to take.
Thanks. Anyone else?
George, if I could just talk about a very specific issue that had come up at the last discussion. There's this question about like, why can't we do 10 stories instead of 14? Hilton Garden Inn is 10 stories. And I think this group has talked about economies of scale and building code requirements that kind of push you towards that 12-story number. And so I do think maybe addressing that issue and starting specifically from those questions that were raised at the last community advisory group meetings, I think would be helpful.
Sure. I would ask the developer to come to that meeting with the kind of examples, local examples that people could experience by walking around that are similar to what's being proposed here. 10, 12, 14-story buildings adjacent to lower rise stuff would be very helpful.
Yeah, so certainly, yeah. I mean, that's something we can revisit as well. I think we haven't done it as a dedicated as a part of the conversation, but we can definitely kind of pull back some precedent imagery and try to dig out some other places, like you said, maybe even go nationally if we can find examples that that would illustrate it as well. Just try to kind of get as best we can.
Bethesda, Maryland definitely has examples of this.
Right.
Great, yeah.
I would say though that the more we can send somebody someplace where they can walk, it
Yep.
really makes a difference, right? And I'm going to stress this, that it would be well worth the time to say, well, we're going to go to the Fenway and walk around and hear your thoughts, because the neighbors are never going to say, and again, with all due respect, Carla and Janice, the neighbors are never going to say, we want you to build a 14-story building. Please build a 14-story building. But what we can really do here is really, really hear people and try to address some of the concerns, because I feel like that is making progress down this path, right? You never get to the point where people say, we're 100% on board, right? Because it's change and people don't like change. So really push to show that it's here, right? Because when you show something in California or in Bethesda, and I've been to Bethesda and it's a great example, it's easy for people to say, yeah, but that's not here, right? Like we got to show that we're not carving new ground in the Boston market and in a Boston
Sandy,
suburb.
Where we want to get is for Janice to say, oh, it's not totally terrible.
Right. That would be awesome. If Janice were ever to say like, yes, please build this, I would be like, let me throw her a party, right? Let's go do that.
No.
Because I would do that for anyone who said, yes, please bring this. But it doesn't, it's too big of a lift, right? Like what can we get? And to get somebody to say, it was Michael's point, like, yeah, I really want to have a coffee shop I can walk to without having to cross Route 9. That's a material win.
Sure. Ken?
Just following up on Meredith's comment, I think one of the things that came up and I started my comments about is also including just some realistic checkpoints about building footprints and floor plates. And I sense there's resistance to getting into that level of detail, but I would just note that the zoning included proposed step backs at upper levels and things like that. So when you're sort of mixing and that was an attempt, I think, to further move the massing away from the southwest corner. So there might be just a reality check on that point as well.
Thanks. Carla?
This is a question for Sandy. Why would you, or why have you suggested the Fenway area?
I don't think I was the one who suggested it, but I do think that the Fenway is a good example. Actually, I did suggest the Idol because it has a variety of heights in it. And the old Fenway was just was more 3, 4, 5-story buildings. It's obviously very different than this neighborhood, but the truth of the matter is that the places like a better example is Kendall Square in some ways that I think is somewhat more relevant. But I think this is, and I'm just being really honest here, Carla. I think that people would think, oh my God, we don't want it to become Kendall Square. Kendall Square is so huge. But Kendall Square has, you know, infinitely more land area that was developable than this area. Whereas the Fenway, really, when you're walking on Queensboro and Jersey Street, it still feels really neighborhoody. It still feels like the Fenway felt
Yeah.
25 years ago
You
when
know-
I lived there when I was going to school, right? And even with these big buildings, bigger buildings, I think if you ask people in the Fenway, they went from having like 3 or 4 places to eat to having an infinite number of options and the ability to go to, you know, the Target, which we may or may not like, but there wasn't a drugstore there. You went to that Star Market and it wasn't really great. Like, so your livability in that neighborhood for the people that have lived there for a long time, and there are people that own condos in there, as much as it's a heavily rental area, it's probably a much better place to live today than it was back then. So that's why I recommend it, because it has that variety of height in it.
Yeah.
Can
And
you
I would also just add, say, I think it's a great corollary in that you have one main corridor, right? And you have Boylston, we have all the height, and it steps down, right? Well, now there's some other WS, but then, and the same thing with Route 9. You got kind of Route 9, and then it steps down right from, so it's sort of a main corridor, which is the linear kind of center, and then you have, you know, kind of a step down thereafter. It becomes more of a neighborhood, if you will. So that's why I think Fenway as well is sort of it's an interesting corollary to the Route 9.
So can you think of anything that is not in a city? In other words, something that more of a suburban context that could also be
So-
used as an illustration?
So I would say in Malden has some taller buildings around. I worry that people in and I'm just again being honest, then people in Brookline will say, well, we're not Malden. But Malden has a
They also say we're not Boston.
right, exactly. So Malden, Somerville, like the point about Assembly Row is a really good point. I actually worked on that project. There was a lot of concern from the East Somerville neighborhood. It's a little more separated in some areas, but there are areas where it's close to some older homes. Everett has some very sizable buildings that butt up to, oh gosh, I can't remember the name. There's a little bitty neighborhood in Everett that is like wrapped around some of those very large buildings. Again, it's a much denser neighborhood. The further out you get, you don't really get to, I mean, Brookline is very unique, right? That is one of the challenges, is we are more akin to Cambridge, right, than we are to Lexington, truthfully, in terms of form. So I would say that, you know, Cambridge Kendall Square is probably a really good example, right, for proximity, or East Cambridge, looking at the area near the courthouse in East Cambridge. That's a good example of height in a neighborhood. George, you guys worked on that building, so maybe you've got
The
some
other funny
thoughts there as I
example
try to throw these out.
is right across Route 9. It's the towers at Chestnut Hill, which are like 16 stories immediately adjacent to a single family street. You know, now it's set back from Route 9, so you don't notice it, but its adjacency to single family houses is closer than any single family house would be to the 14-story building proposed on this site. So Chestnut Hill Towers, right next to the mall.
And you know, and to that point, George, I mean, how big is that building on Florence Street? I mean, is that an 8-story building? Is it a 12-story building?
You know, I don't know, Sandy.
Yeah.
But I think actual examples are really a good idea.
Yeah.
Really a good idea.
I was also going to pick up on where I think Michael Sandman was going, is like, you know, selling the benefits, right? And not to volunteer anything for Cliff, but you know, what is it? You know, I promise one farmer's market a week, you know, and I promise like park day or out, whatever it is, it's sort of programming, like things for and about giving back to the, you know, the neighbors and things like that, right? So I think that's all about, you know, selling the benefits of what does this do or the people who live next door, right? And how do they feel a part of it? So just building that connectivity.
I agree. Anyone else? Subcommittee, is there anything else that you wanted to go over today? I understand we're standing between all the participants and their weekends. So if there's nothing else, we can chat offline, Meredith, about materials that we might want the developer to bring to the meeting.
Well, okay, so just not to be standing between everyone in the weekend, but so City Realty isn't presenting anything. They're not on the agenda for this meeting. So I do think, and it sounds like Cliff is happy to provide some additional examples as sort of references for the subcommittee members to use. So it kind of sounds like there's going to be some sort of a slide deck, initial table setting discussion with subcommittee members, and then
You
it
mean
can be Q&A.
we're preparing a presentation?
I would.
I don't see that happening.
Okay. So is it going to be more?
None of us have, I don't think, the capacity or the time to do that.
Okay, so is this going to be more of like a freewheeling Q&A with the community advisory group members then?
I think so.
Okay. So hopefully we'll have the responses by the end of the day on Monday, so I can send that out to the subcommittee members.
Meredith, maybe you and I can brainstorm and at least grab some useful images or some other elements that can demonstrate some of the things that they've talked about.
Okay. That would be good. And to the extent that any subcommittee members have additional time to send some reference materials or anything that, you think would be a helpful reference point after this discussion, that would be very helpful. We are down 2 staff members and we have not a ton of time to prepare for the meeting.
Okay. Happy to help.
Okay.
Over the next couple of days.
Yeah. George, I may reach out to you and Sandy and Mark just to sort of bounce some ideas around.
Sure. Anything else? Move to adjourn? Subcommittee members, you guys good with that?
All good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you all.
Thank you all.
Have a good weekend. Bye.